you to another edition of Marriage Encounter. We are always delighted to be with you on the airways of Second Advent Radio. And for those of you who are joining via our various social media platforms, we welcome you. Likewise, we trust that today's encounter will prove meaningful in helping to build meaningful relationships with your spouse. This program, Marriage Encounter, is really all about building strong, healthy marriages. We like to say that marriage is a journey towards intimacy. And we share useful tips. We discuss concepts, issues, ideas, so that you can have a better relationship. With me is Pastor Staton Adams. Good day, Pastor Adams, and welcome.
Good day, Dr. Greene, and good day to our listening, viewing audience. We thank you again for making this your weekly appointment, Marriage Encounter. And as we are always saying, it's time well spent investing in the improving of your relationships for the betterment of your family.
Well, we want to have a word of prayer at this time, shall we? Eternal Father and our God, we thank you for the privilege and opportunity to share with our friends on this another Marriage Encounter broadcast. We pray that you will take full control of today's program and help that, God, the information presented will help to strengthen marriages and provide hope and healing for individuals who need it. In Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
We have been discussing this whole matter of some don'ts with respect to if your spouse is not a boundary-loving spouse, some of the things you ought not to do. Before we get into the things you ought to do, there are a few more that we want to emphasize. And today, Pastor, I want to begin. I think when we left last time, we spoke about not nagging. We said you should not nag. And I want to just also add, and I highlighted this. I think this is our closing point last week when I read a statement from Cloud and Towson. Don't be constantly surprised at your spouse's behavior. It's a sign of a defensive hoping against hope. You know, if you realize, you know already that your spouse is not a boundary lover, you know that your spouse has a particular challenge. It's a character issue. Remember, this is the context that we're talking about. When there is a character problem, if you know that your spouse has a character problem, then don't be surprised by his or her behavior. You already know that it's a character problem. And so what needs to happen is that he or she needs to get help. Last week, we spent a lot of time talking about taking responsibility for your character problem and getting help. So don't be surprised by the behavior. What you ought to do is to insist that your partner gets the help that is necessary.
Yes, and we also said that that's the person's work responsibility, which you cannot do for them. The best you can do is support them in the process. And that is not that you don't have any role to play. You just have the supporting role, because I thought we should have clarified that last week to say, okay, well, the person is on their own. Yes, they have to do the work because it is their problem. And but with your support, right? Your support and support, like words of encouragement. I see you trying. I notice some improvement. Kudos. You bring a little token of appreciation or something to say, I noticed that this thing is working and things are that you have the supporting role to play, but it's still the person's work to do.
Correct. Now, the other point that we're making here, I think is one that needs to be emphasized. Don't blame. Blaming is very common, it's very popular. It's almost a self-defense mechanism, but it's very destructive. And we want to note that in a marriage relationship, there's hardly ever a time when one individual is 100% wrong and the other one is 100% right. It's a relationship, and because there is no perfect partner, we can expect that both spouses contribute to challenges and to successes likewise. So you don't really want to go blaming an individual. You know, at the end of the day, it's your marriage. Not so?
Yes, and well, sometimes the blaming comes to the point where it's sort of an excuse for my behavior, because I hear people say, well, because you did so and so and so, right? That is why I did so and so and so. No, no, no. You cannot blame a person to the point where you're going to use it as an excuse for your behavior, or how you respond. No, no, no. That can't be at all. We've been stressing that, well, we said that many I think it was many programs ago, where maturity calls for one to take responsibility for his or her behavior, right? And don't shift the blame. Look at it squarely. You have to point the finger at you first to see if you have contributed in any way. If you are culpable, you have to admit and confess and take responsibility. But shifting the blame, well, that's an Eden issue, you know. Adam said the woman. From there back, we had blaming in relationship. Adam said, the woman you give to me. She said, the serpent, right? So blaming is not a new thing in relationships, right? But we have to take responsibility for our thing. It's a false way of coping with the situation or with the problem when we begin to play the blame game. Right. When relationships, and I normally tell people that when I'm working with them through conflicts, you know, when you take that concerted unity approach, regardless of who caused the problem, and instead of start throwing blame around, and you fix it and resolve it, it's evidence that this relationship is healthy and you're maturing and you're growing, right? Than to resort to shifting blame. That doesn't solve the problem. It still remains.
And blaming has a way of shifting, you know, the real issue. It's almost making an excuse. And I like what you said, Pastor, because if I begin to say you are the reason why I am behaving like this, then I am failing to take responsibility. So don't go
Yes.
and finally, under the don't take total ownership of the problem. Now, remember, we're talking about a character issue. Last week, we mentioned that when there is a character issue, if you discover that your spouse has a character issue, your spouse is otherwise a good person, a loving person, kind person, but this particular area is a challenge. And we shared several examples of what that could be. Don't try to overlook the real issue. If you take total ownership of the problem and begin to say that it's your problem when it's not your problem. So if you rescue your spouse, constantly bailing out your spouse and taking responsibility, what you are doing eventually is to empower him or her. And
Yes,
things will not get
it's
better, things will get worse.
enabling behaviors.
Correct.
You want to be responsible for enabling behaviors. Yeah. Well, that's a clinical term that we use when people have issue with substance, and so, you know, and you develop the whole issue of people becoming codependent, because there are those who enable the person in the particular behavior by taking responsibility and feeling guilty, and maybe it's their fault, and so, you know, no. The person has to take responsibility for their actions, their behavior, and do what they are supposed to do. You don't take that on yourself. You did not cause the problem. Once you can identify that really, I did not cause the problem, I did not contribute in any way to this problem. That's why I normally say you point the finger at yourself first to see if in any way I have contributed by what I said or done anyway. No, if that's not the case, the person must take responsibility and deal with the problem as it relates to them. Yeah, but you don't take that on as your problem or your responsibility. For it is our problem. Yes, I said you support, but the person has to take responsibility and do what they have to do.
Now, Pastor, we want to shift the discussion a little to the matter of some things you ought to do. If your spouse is not a boundary lover, and especially when your spouse has a character problem, and you have to take boundaries. The discussion on boundaries is an important one because a lot of times when you decide that you are going to stick to the matter, you know, let me put it this way. If your spouse is crossing boundaries all the time, doing things that he or she should not do, when you decide to stand up, it can threaten the survival of your marriage. So it requires a certain degree of strength to be able to insist that I'm not going to live under these circumstances. If, let's say, your spouse is an addict, your spouse is addicted to some substance, you know, and you get to the point where you say, listen, I am no longer prepared to live under these circumstances. You're going to get help. You're going to have to go to counseling. You're going to have to do therapy. If you don't do it, I'm very sorry. That can be a challenge. And sometimes the pushback we get is, well, so be it, so be it. I've had situations where one partner says to the other, that woman, and I want to be practical, that woman is a threat to our marriage. You were involved with her before, and it is creeping back into uh, the picture, and it's creating a conflict. If you don't do something about it, if I see you in her car again, we're going to take action. And I've heard individuals say, well, listen, she's my friend and I'm not going to stop talking to her. And so if you want to, whatever, then that's it. And in a situation like that, you can find yourself saying, wow, I'm going to lose my husband, or I'm going to lose my wife, as the case may be. If you do not have a good support network, it can be very challenging. So one of the first things we want to talk about is this matter of making what we want to call soul connections, having individuals that you trust, individuals that you can confide in. We're talking about, you know, we discussed sometime in the past, Pastor, having an accountability partner, a really
Yes.
good friend, a solid individual who has the moral principles and the experience to be able to give you support and comfort. We need to have a few persons in our circle who can give us emotional support. There are some spouses who have nobody else that they can talk to beside their husband or their wife. That's a little challenging. You may want
Yeah.
to comment on that.
Yes, and I'm glad you stressed those persons must be chosen very carefully. And because, you know, when you're on a point of your vulnerability, people can use that for their own selfish interests and exploit that situation. So you have to be very careful who those friends are that will give you that kind of support. It can't be anybody, right? It has to be solid people who have their relationships intact and are not, you know, not just anybody, because that could be problematic. You have to be very mindful as to who those people are. They've got to be real, as you said, morally solid people, as you mentioned, and we can't over stress that point, because, you know, there's the point of vulnerability when we turn to someone for help and we get that kind of connection to them, and that could be a little problematic. I'm talking about crossing sexes now, so maybe you should have a very good girlfriend. Women have their, what we say, women have their society where they can girl talk, they cry with each other, and so that kind of a thing. But we males, we have a problem because we think that we don't need to have any close friend, any accountability partner. We don't have to have anybody, you know, I could man up this thing and I could tough this out, and we are dying in silence from inside because of this mature how we were nurtured, you know. But we need somebody, you see, I always tell men that you need three persons, three other males in your life that are very close to you. You need an older person who've been here, done this, passed this way. You need a peer, somebody equal with you who can talk to you very straight and tell you, well, Dr. Greene, I think no, that's the wrong thing you're doing. Reason this out, get up, we fight, we quarrel, but we are friends. Then you have a younger person who you need to set an example to, who you can pass on things to, who you can mentor. A man cannot be alone. Well, I just thought that I should say that because men are most likely are the ones who don't have close connection with other buddies who they can talk to. I have had those in my life. Times when I came to real challenging, difficult situation, I have friends who I can talk to, with all the information and skill that I have. There are times when you yourself need to talk to somebody. You can lean on and run some, lean on me when you're not strong. Yes.
I think, Pastor, this is such an important point, and I'm glad you raised it. I'm talking about talking to the men. This feeling of being macho, being a man, and I can fend for myself and I can solve my own problems, and I don't need anybody to tell me how to run my life. That can sometimes be very misleading. So what we are saying here now is, I want to go back to the element. I like the idea of the three significant individuals, somebody that you mentor because you ought to be an example to somebody,
Yes.
but somebody who is your peer that can talk to you at your level, and a more mature senior person who you can look up to and give you the kind of guidance. But here's the point behind having an accountability partner. There are going to be times when you find yourself in a spot of bother. And if you have nobody, there is this notion that men are not emotional creatures. We are emotional creatures. And we do not express our emotions. It can be very damaging. And I'm using my words carefully. It can be very damaging. And every now and then. So take what we are discussing here. When you realize that you have a situation, so here's a man who is married, his wife has a character issue. It's a concern, she is crossing boundaries, and he decides to stand up. He decides to say, listen, we're going to have to solve this problem. And she gets off and decides, she's going to be her own boss. She doesn't want to. That can be a situation if he has nobody else to turn to, just to give him a little support there. It can be a real challenge for him. And it's a good idea if you have this mature individual in your life, a person who has very solid moral values, that you can say, hey, did I go about this right? Did I make a mistake in saying so or in demanding this? And that person can talk to you honestly and frankly. That can be a comfort. It's so important to be able to do that. As counselors, sometimes, Pastor Adams, I'm sure you can identify with this. An individual calls or comes to see you, and they sit down and you listen to them, and they speak for half an hour. And when they finish, they say, thank you so much. You have been such a tremendous help. And you have not done anything except to listen.
Yes.
Because that need to be able to be, not have a sounding board somewhere else.
Right. That happens. Yes. And that is the truth, because counselors, we listen more than we talk. Right. We listen more than we talk. That's one of the basic principles of the counseling profession. You have to listen. The client is in charge most of the time, but not you. You have to listen more than you talk. Yeah, so it is very important that we cannot overemphasize, because while we are talking to the general principle, we just are identifying who can be at fault and would really need somebody to help them and to be accountable to. And as the literature shows it, women are more inclined to talk to their peers, talk to their girlfriend, but us males, no, we don't. How we were nurtured and socialized, we have a problem talking to people on a personal on a personal level and ventilating our issues. Yes, and if we don't, if we are not men who are not heard are men that will hurt. Either they hurt themselves or hurt others. Right? Yes.
That's so correct. The, it's really important for us to emphasize self-care for men. You go to retreats all the time and you hear women talking about self-care. But this matter of self-care for men, it's important because
Yes.
society teaches us that, you don't need that. You need to be rough, you
Mhm.
need to be tough.
Mhm. Yes.
So,
Mhm.
so every now and when you look at the state of society, when you look at where our men are, lots of young men, lots of men are struggling. Lots of men have issues. They have issues with how their fathers related to them. Many of them grew up in homes where there was no father figure, where there was
Yes.
nobody to be an example and a model for
Mhm.
them. And so
Yes.
when you mention you should have a younger male as a man to mentor, there is the need so much for lots of our young boys to have somebody out there who can mentor them, who can be a
Mhm.
father figure to them, who can be somebody who can listen to them and share with them and guide them. And you know what that does for you as an individual? It helps you to be accountable. It helps you to know that, listen, I'm not just living for myself alone. I'm also living to help shape a future society through these
Mhm.
individuals that I am mentoring. That's so important. That's really crucial.
Yes, very, 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 very important. Very important. We cannot overemphasize that. So very important. Yeah. Um,
I,
I
I want,
benefited from here. So we can go on.
yeah, sorry. I was going to say, I just wanted us to go back to this point about this making soul connections, because, there's so many cases that are out there where a spouse has nobody to talk to but their mate. If you are married and you have no friends, now we were created for relationships.
Yes.
So in a good marriage, you should have a network of friends. You should have people that you interact with. If your spouse does not want you to relate to anybody else, then that is a problem. Um, there are going to be times when you need, as a young lady, to go on a girls' out with your female friends.
Yeah, night out.
There are going to be times when, as a man, you need to go and play a football game or a cricket game or a tennis game or something to that effect, and
Mhm.
and share on man-to-man level. It's good to have friends. You did mention, Pastor Adams, that we need to be careful about the boundaries of the opposite sex and maturity
Yes.
there. And maybe you want to say a word on that because, especially in today's context, that's important.
Yes. So while you may have friends from the opposite sex, you have to make sure that the boundaries are in line, kept in touch. That's what I wanted to say because, on the point of vulnerability, a lot of things can happen. So yes, you have to be sure that either way, they are moral people, and who will not exploit a situation for what it is, because there can be some complexities if we are not careful how we manage those kind of interactions, right? So boundaries and well, you had said that already, that it should be morally stable and solid individuals, and you have to make sure that the boundaries are maintained um, at the same time. Very, 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 very importantly, very importantly. But I was going to say something that I missed. Um, when we do not have somebody who we can turn to, who we can speak with and have, that is the fastest way when all of that stuff is going on in that situation there and there's no one you can speak to. I mean, apart from a professional counselor and so, the issue of that relationship can become, or that family setting can become dysfunctional very quickly. And that is the last thing you want to happen, right? Because dysfunctionality begins in what's going to begin to happen there is that you're going to, everything about how you talk to each other, communication, how you resolve conflict, all of those things are going through the window, you know, and you may resort to the kind of criticisms, you know, and even avoidance altogether. Placating, a number of the things that cause a family to become dysfunctional, and that you don't want that at all. So we just have to just the issue itself, but you have to look at the bigger picture, what this can lead to if we don't get it right.
Well, we're going to wrap up now because our time is just about ended, but I wanted to just make this point very quickly, Pastor Adams. And that's the area of, so just to go back a little bit to the opposite sex. I like to say that it is important that you want to be careful not to discuss some personal issues with members of the opposite sex, unless you're in a counseling situation. Because if I have a good friend who is female and I begin to share with them about marital issues that I'm having, then that is leading into a very precarious place. Of course, unless the lady who I am talking to can be my mother. You understand?
Yeah,
right?
yes.
You know, yes. But if I have a work colleague and I'm talking to my work colleague about issues that are happening between my spouse and myself, that's treading on dangerous grounds. You know, we can talk about transparency. We can see how that is setting the ground for connections that are not healthy.
Yeah, that is what we're talking about. So you have to be very mindful as to who and the level that you will speak, disclose. And of course, your spouse knows who your friends are. And, you know, so this is very important, you know. I know, you know, I know my spouse know who my friends are, you see. They could have been people that you met and know long before you got married. You have grown up together, respected. I have some friends from high school, you know, very close friends from high school. You see, so you have friends, and your spouse should know who your friends are, your close friends.
Correct. Well, we're going to have to stay here for today. It was a pleasure sharing, and we invite you to send your comments, your questions to marriageencounter@slcadventist.org. That is marriageencounter@slcadventist.org. Until next week, same time, may God's richest blessings be yours.
Ba-ba-ba-bum, ba-ba-ba-bum.